Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I spoke with Ron Noble, who is the Chief of Teacher Prep at NCTQ, which is the National Council for Teacher Quality. We talked about their new initiative, which is transforming teacher prep, and a job posting that I had seen for a project lead for that. Suffice it to say that most teachers, or at least many, don't report much satisfaction with their teacher prep programs. So thinking about how we might improve them is worth much more than this conversation. I won't go into the details. Those details are on the episode webpage at wegrowteachers.com. I would like to remind you, though, to visit our website for our professional learning services, which is wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find our blogs and podcasts and all of our professional learning services, all focused through the lens of inquiry. And I'd also like to mention that we are still in the early bird phases for Inquiry Grow 26, which will be held in Louisville, October 26th and 27th. And that will focus on knowledge-rich inquiry. If you are into project-based learning and looking for sort of a next step, that's a good option. Or if you are just looking for ways in which to grow your teaching through inquiry with a synergy with cognitive science principles, that might be a good fit for you as well. Again, that is at wegrowteachers.com. And if you have any questions about that or anything else, feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. Now here's my conversation with Ron. I'm with Ron Noble, who is, as I understand it, the Chief of Teacher Prep at NCTQ, National Council for Teacher Quality. I think I got that right. Acronyms abound in education, but I had seen a posting, I think on LinkedIn, that was about a job opportunity. I think it's a project lead for an initiative that NCTQ is launching, is going to try to make some things happen. And I think I've got the name right, Transforming Teacher Prep, which piqued my interest for some obvious reasons and maybe some not so obvious reasons. So I reached out and said, let's talk about it. So Ron's here to tell us a little bit more about it and to answer some questions and give us some background. But before we do get to that part, Ron, give you a chance to introduce yourself and give anyone who's listening or the savages who are watching us to get a sense of who you are.
Thanks, Drew. It's great to be with you today. You got my title correct. I'm the Chief of Teacher Prep at NCTQ, the National Council on Teacher Quality. I've been with the organization almost 3 years now. Came out of a district leadership role where I was deputy superintendent in Methuen, Massachusetts, a gateway city in my home state. And prior to that, worked for a bunch of years at the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education here in Massachusetts, where I worked on a whole range of things related to teacher quality. But my first and most important job was as a middle school math teacher in New York City, where I taught for 4 years and really learned a lot about what teacher prep helped me get ready to do and where I felt like, wow, I wish I had someone go over things a little bit differently before it became the real deal in front of 32 kids looking to me for answers. So
right.
That's sort of what's motivated me to continue on in this work.
Okay, so on that note, what if you don't mind sharing, what was your teacher prep? Where'd you go? What was it like? How I mean, you characterized it a little bit, and no surprise, most teachers don't tend to have the best reflections on their teacher prep. I think that's an interesting dynamic for a number of reasons. But what was yours like?
Yeah, I'm in that camp of man, I wish things had gone a little bit different for me in teacher prep. I was a sort of a latecomer to the teaching career. I was in law school and realized that wasn't the best fit for me and was looking for a different pathway. Both my parents are teachers. My grandfather was a teacher, so education's always been around my family, really important to us. And so I said, well, what would it take to go off and get a teaching license? And at the time I was living in New Jersey, and the New York City Teaching Fellows Program, which was being run by TNTP at the time, was underway. It was in their, I think I was part of their 8th cohort. And so what that entailed was going through a rigorous selection process and then being assigned to a graduate level teacher prep program within the CUNY system. So my assignment was in the City University of New York at City College. We did this really intense summer pre-service, almost like a boot camp style training, where we were doing a whole bunch of foundational coursework, trying to get our basic understanding of what the teaching craft is supposed to be like, and getting some content boosters, because it had been years before I had taken any sort of formal math coursework as an undergraduate. And then also we were doing student teaching in summer school. So we were assigned to a mentor teacher who was running summer school, and we were put through the paces in a cohort model for some summer training on the ground with real students. But everything was too short, too quick, and sort of launched that first day of the school year feeling like, man, I there's way more that I don't know than what I know, as I'm about to be responsible for the math livelihood of almost 100 students. So that definitely stuck with me for many, many years, and wondered if there's a different way.
Yeah.
I will say, the one thing I will give the program credit for is we did have that embedded opportunity to practice teaching in that summer school environment. While not perfect, my organization did a report last year where we found that over 60% of the alternative pathways into teaching don't involve any clinical experience at all. So even that little bit, that few weeks I got with those kids under the tutelage of a mentor, is a huge step up from what a lot of folks are getting when they're launching through those alternative programs, and they're assigned immediately as teachers of record with no coursework under their belt and certainly no practice opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I don't think we haven't had a chance to talk off record a whole lot. And folks who are listeners to this podcast will know that we do a lot of professional development. And so we work with teachers in schools after pre-service, beg some questions. One of the things that certainly I have found, like we do a 3-day workshop on project-based learning, for example, and while it's packed with lots of information, conceptual knowledge, and things like that, when we talk about how do you make meaning of things, of those concepts, it's really when you start to try them in your classroom, right? It's that contextualization, it's the reflection, and how did that go and how did that not go, and all of those things. And of course, as my daughter is in her pre-service program, trying to peer over her shoulders and thinking, when is she going to be in the classroom? But it's a really tough challenge. So I'm sure we'll get to that. So the Transforming Teacher Prep Initiative, kind of give us the elevator pitch for this. You've talked a little bit. We've talked a bit about teacher prep and the need for improvement. And it's never going to be perfect. It'll always be something under development. But why? What's the why behind this initiative, if there's anything more to it than what you've already articulated?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, at NCTQ, we've got over 20 years under our belt now of looking at the quality of teacher education across the country. One of the consistent things we find is that teacher preparation can be slow to change and slow to take on some of the new things that are happening in K-12. And so we want to build coherence between what candidates like your daughter are learning in pre-service and what she's going to be expected to do on day one when she gets to her first position in a district, and making that as seamless an experience for the individual teacher candidate as possible. And so part of the impetus behind Transforming Teacher Prep is we feel like there are two main actors that have a lot of agency in terms of what that experience for candidates in the teacher prep programs looks like. The first are states. States are the authorizers in every case of teacher prep programs within their state boundaries. They're the ones who are deciding who's eligible to endorse candidates for licensure and not. And so we think there's a lot of value in supporting state education agencies to really take stock at their teacher prep policies and say, do we have something coherent here? Are we going to get the type of new teachers that we know we need to meet the needs of our students based on what we've set forth in state policy? And so one of the strands of work we have under the Transforming Teacher Prep umbrella is deep partnership with a small number of states to really help them do that landscape analysis of their policy, give them some concrete recommendations and some coaching support to get them ready to change policy, add policy, take away policy, whatever's necessary to really enable teacher prep programs to do the job that they're charged with doing, which is meaningful preparation for the next generation of teachers. The other big bet we have is that intrinsic change is possible within teacher prep programs. And so the job posting you saw, Drew, is for the second strand of work under the Transforming Teacher Prep umbrella, which is focused on cultivating innovation within teacher prep programs themselves, such that we can be the storytellers and we can help other programs replicate some smart strategies that are being pursued by sort of the tip of the spear programs. And so what we're setting out to do is to identify a small number of teacher prep programs that have a really interesting and innovative idea, help fund that idea, help support them with coaching. And then ultimately our hope is that we are hitting upon things that are scalable and replicable across the country to really help teacher prep sort of own the change from within. And so those are the two bets we're making with the project.
Okay. So the state policy, that brings up actually related to a question that I was going to ask before you started talking about it, but it also, is relevant, not just from the policy perspective, but one of the things that I maintain, a lot of the culture war stuff where it surfaces and all these accusations of teacher prep programs being really politically charged and developing activists and things like that. And we don't need to get into the weeds of that kind of thing. But what strikes me is that there are vast differences in terms of teacher prep programs across the country. And while you might have, Columbia Teachers College or a teacher prep program in Kentucky here, I think you're going to see much, much different sort of approaches in terms of even those culture war kinds of things. But I guess more broadly, based on the research and in your experience and NCTQ's experience, what are the differences, or how do those differences play out in terms of quality and approach and adoption of techniques and cognitive science and those kinds of things in differing teacher prep programs across the country?
Yes, we look at a handful of different aspects of teacher preparation in our teacher prep review. We look, for example, at how well programs are preparing elementary teachers to teach math. We know math requires that balance of intense time building the teacher's content knowledge in the content that they're going to be responsible for teaching. If the teacher doesn't have a deep conceptual understanding of the math they're going to be responsible for, they're going to miss a whole bunch of student misconceptions. They're not going to know how to jump in and help students make sense of things that they're struggling with. And so we know teacher prep needs to provide a balance of content instruction and pedagogical instruction, the how of teaching math. And so what we see across the country is, really wide ranges in terms of how many math courses programs are able to offer. This is a huge problem for graduate level teacher prep programs that just don't have enough real estate within the 1 year term of their program to adequately prepare people in math. But many don't take other low hanging fruit opportunities to help build teacher content knowledge if it can't be through formal coursework. So that's one thing we look at. We look at whether or not the program is aligned to scientifically based reading instruction. Are they still teaching, debunked strategies like whole language and balanced literacy and 3Qing, or are they moving in the right direction toward more structured literacy approaches? And then another big thing is practice. How are programs providing those early entry points into classroom experiences, whether that's through tutoring opportunities or early field placements or simulations, which there's decent research behind. So looking at all the different ways that programs are carving up that candidate experience and making sure that they are, as best as we can tell, aligned to the ever-evolving research base. But we just see tons of differences. And there's always more than one way to skin a cat. And we're not saying there's one prescribed way that every teacher prep program needs to look, but there are some pretty clear signals that we can pick up in our reviews of where teacher prep might need to make some changes.
Yeah, all very, very interesting. Again, it strikes me as just obvious that there's such a difference across the sort of spectrum of teacher prep programs and how they're different. the job application or the job description, the post mentioned something, I think, about being, sort of on board with the NCTQ sort of thinking and approach to teacher education and I guess education in general. And I think you've probably outlined some of those things in that last that last sort of response there. But are there other things or anything else to say about what are the sort of priorities and values of NCTQ in terms of teacher prep and just teaching in general?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about a few of them already, which is strong preparation in math content and pedagogy, adherence to scientifically based reading instruction, really robust practice opportunities. Another one that we just recently published a new framework on that is critically important is around classroom management, and making sure that teacher prep programs have modernized their approach to supporting teacher candidates to be ready to deal with the range of behaviors and needs that they're going to be confronted with when they get into the classroom. We know from the research, one of the main drivers away from the teaching profession once folks get in is their inability to deal with the range of student needs and behaviors that are going to manifest in any classroom across the country. And so we do want to also see teacher prep programs taking that need seriously and helping build candidate skills to then transfer and build student skills into being engaged and well-supported learners.
Yeah. So I see, I'm on social media thinking and talking about this far too much and write about it and have podcast conversations about it. The sort of reading wars, pedagogy wars, traditional versus progressive kinds of teaching. Lots of things to get into there, but you mentioned sort of the management of a classroom and some of the things that teachers are likely to experience. What brings to mind, the sort of pushback that I see sometimes, or championing of relationships and relationship building. Is there anything, in terms of how to navigate that NCTQ sort of recommends or advocates for? I mean, I see people saying, don't do icebreakers, don't do anything at the beginning, just get in there and teach, which strikes me as a little short-sighted in terms of like, okay, let's maybe take some time to do some relationship building. But I also see, I saw some video, I think it was maybe a little bit of a parody, but it wouldn't strike me as being real of taking 10 minutes for handshakes before the kids walked in and, all that sort of fun stuff that is obviously taking time away from teaching. So how do you all at NCTQ think about those kinds of issues?
Yeah, it's a great question, Drew, and we certainly believe that part of teaching is building that culture of trust with the students in your classroom, and we address that in the classroom management framework that I alluded to, and we think that's really important for teacher prep to support candidates to develop that skill around relationship building with the students directly, with their peer teachers, with their families. All of these play into teacher retention, teacher satisfaction in their careers, and ultimately student learning. That said, we also stand firm that one of the biggest reasons why students act out or misbehave is we're wasting their time with what we're asking them to do in the classroom. And so we have to be really thoughtful about what we're tasking students to do in the classroom and making it meaningful to them. Whatever the content area is, whatever the learning standard is, making sure that we're giving them something interesting to think about, interesting to read, interesting to talk about. And in my experience as a recent district leader, that's where we're falling short the most, in my opinion. When I would walk into classrooms, the classrooms that had the best student behavior were the classrooms where the teacher was giving them something really cool to think about and really tapping into what they were already interested in. It was all standards aligned. It was in step with the curriculum that we had adopted, but it was robust and dynamic, and the kids cared about what they were being asked to do. And the classrooms where I saw a lot of contextually inappropriate behavior, it was because they weren't being challenged. They weren't being asked to do anything coherent. They were, it was too worksheet dependent. And so I think a lot of what we're trying to help teacher candidates do during teacher prep is develop that ability to plan from strong curriculum and make it meaningful for kids, for the wide range of kids that they're going to have in their classrooms.
So that brings up the sort of pedagogy wars thing. We do a lot of project-based learning and inquiry work, which of course is sort of meant at least in some ways to engage kids. And of course, engagement is a poor proxy for learning, but there's different ways to talk about engagement, and behavioral engagement is not enough. We want cognitive and academic engagement, all those kinds of things. But the assertion and pushback and the sort of argument that I see from the more traditional end of the spectrum, and I think they're not wrong. I'm curious how NCTQ and you guys think about this, is the embedding and teaching of cognitive science principles, science of learning writ large kinds of principles. The assertion is that is largely absent from teacher prep programs. I'm curious if you agree with that. I tried to find out. I tried to do a little digging, and teacher prep organizations are a bit opaque. I don't know if you've seen that or experienced that, but are they learning about cognitive load theory and desirable difficulties and all of those sort of cognitive science principles that certainly I think are important, but they're only one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, so the most recent report we put out came out in June, and it was a report of elementary teacher prep programs across the country and the extent to which they're aligned to the science of reading, scientifically based reading instruction. And our initial sample, just you spoke about opaqueness. This will shed a little light and quantify that a little bit for us from our perspective. Our initial sample is about 1,200 teacher prep programs across the country, and our final report included about 720 programs. And so all of that delta, that difference between who we reached out to and who we were able to report on, are programs that opted out of the review, that refused to hand over course materials to us, and even many public institutions that hid behind their state's open records laws and just refused to share copies of their syllabi and other basic materials that talk about what they're doing in their programs. And so I think you're right. I think there's a lot of misaligned practice that's hiding from accountability, and that's a big concern for us at NCTQ. Of the programs we were able to review, we did add this time around. We did ask our expert reading analysts to look for evidence that the programs were teaching science of learning principles. It was the first time we've done that. We didn't formally bake it into our scoring of programs. We did use it as a distinguishing characteristic for programs that earned an A+ in the analysis. And it's sort of our initial baseline. We didn't find a ton of evidence that programs were doing this. Certainly not to the extent where when you read articles about what's happening in the UK, for example, where their entire teacher prep curriculum has been reoriented around the science of learning principles. I don't think we're anywhere near that, but a lot of our leading advisors around reading have said, that's the next step here. We've sort of jumped the gun with the science of reading movement. We need to back up and undergird that with a strong foundation in science of learning principles. Because that is something we've been talking about internally. Is that sort of another frontier for us to explore and try to get our hands around the extent to which programs are already doing that or not.
And in the surveys, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you asked in the survey how much of that science of learning is in their programs. Was it just, what was the quantification for that? What were there ways in which could they just say yes and that would be it? Or, surely it was more deep than that.
So it's not a survey at all. So what we do is we ask programs to submit course materials for each of their required reading courses. And then we've got a team of expert reading analysts that go through those courses, and they're trained up on our protocol. So one of the pieces of the protocol they were asked to look for this time around is evidence of science of learning content. And we gave them a whole sort of bank of keywords that they might encounter that would be relevant to the science of learning. Again, we haven't done much with that data yet. It was really just to get an initial sense for us, like how prevalent is this?
That's interesting. Yeah, and again, as I, peer over the shoulder of my daughter's program, I do see some evidence. She's been disabused twice in two different classes about learning styles as being, something that teachers should design their instruction for, that kind of thing. But it does strike me, science of reading has definitely had a moment, and now starting to see some pushback on some of that. Maybe, the pendulum swing that always happens in education, or always seems to happen. Now we're seeing some pushback to that, from various corners. And while I think science of learning is important, there are some trade-offs there, because there's a finite amount of time that you have with students in pre-service programs. And add to that they don't really have context, especially if they're not in classrooms and actually teaching. So, I wonder what the value, like how to determine. I'm curious if you all have thought through this and what you're sort of advocating for in terms of how do you determine what to prioritize? Because that's what you have to do with any, teaching. You've got a finite amount of time, and generally more to get through and cover than you have time for. So there's going to be trade-offs. And, let it be said that in our project-based learning workshops, it's not unusual for teachers to say, well, I never really learned about project-based learning in my teacher pre-service. So it's not like I say, well, what are they learning? I'm not really sure. And maybe it's a lot of content and not so much pedagogy. But I guess, how do you all, have you started to wrap your head around the prioritization and how you would what the criteria for that?
Yeah, that is a huge challenge. I think both in pre-service and even in K-12 is this balance of all of the competing demands on limited instructional time. And this is the reality of every elementary teacher every day in every school across the country. But it also is equally meaningful in teacher prep. And we don't have sort of a magic formula worked out, or even a real deep understanding of what are the most essential courses and how should those courses be designed to sort of optimize the student experience. We're open to lots of different configurations and durations and all of those things, as long as you're hitting on some of these key research-based principles. And so, I don't have a great answer for you on how to squeeze science of learning in and what can fall out. I think that's going to be really contextually dependent on where the bloat is within a given program, whether there is even bloat to begin with. I mean, one of the things we're constantly up against is around graduate programs that only have a year of coursework to fit everything in, and you're asking them to do the same job as an undergraduate program that has at least double that amount of time. So that's a challenge, and I don't have a great answer for how to overcome it. I think there are lots of technical assistance partners out there doing like sort of forensic style audits of teacher prep programs and really getting into the weeds and saying, this is where you've got some room to carve. It could be an entire course that gets jettisoned, or more than likely it's going to be a more targeted amendment within courses, like lecture 5, only doesn't need to be there. We're going to swap that out and instead allocate it to something else. I think there are folks doing that sort of deep dive work.
Yeah. And one of the questions that I've begun to ask, somewhat rhetorically, but not completely, is, so let's assume that if we're going to use science of learning, or, if you could do the same thing with a more progressive, although both sides say the other is hegemonic in terms of teacher prep, which is obviously not possible. They can't both be hegemonic. But that being said, let's say, we do have a really robust implementation of science and learning principles in teacher preparation. What would they expect the difference to be? Like, what would that actually look like in teachers and in our schools? And because again, there are trade-offs. So obviously we want teachers to come out of teacher prep ready to teach and teach well, but that's sort of an abstract, right? Are there some assumptions that we want to take into account of that they might have some apprenticeship as they enter the workforce, or some support, or they may not have any support? Like, what if anything, does NCTQ have in mind in terms of this is sort of quantifiable and qualitatively what we think teachers should have and be ready to do as they enter the workforce, day one kind of thing?
Yeah, we are certainly intrigued by the burgeoning interest in registered teacher apprenticeships. I think we're almost now at almost every state has engaged in a formal partnership to get registered teacher apprenticeships off the ground. And that model is really interesting because it does exactly what we've been talking about. It gives folks an opportunity to learn things and then try them out and then adjust based on that experience, and all of that under the stewardship of a highly qualified mentor. That's the crux of it, is you need to have access to that highly qualified mentor who's going to support you as you're growing. We are staunch advocates at NCTQ for in-service mentorship, knowing that the learning doesn't stop when you finish your teacher prep program and you enter the classroom. So we absolutely look for district policy related to and state policy related to mentorship for early career in-service teachers. So that's definitely a piece of this conversation for sure. As far as what those non-negotiables are, I think if a teacher prep program were to reorient itself around the science of learning, some of the things we would expect to see that might look different in their teacher candidates is, I think, the transition for those folks from prep to in-service utilization of high-quality instructional materials that are in place in districts would be more seamless, because a lot of those curricula are designed with science of learning principles in place. And I think what we would find is teacher prep candidates who have been trained in that are entering classrooms now understanding, okay, I understand why we're revisiting concepts, 2 weeks after we introduce them, because that's part of the cognitive load theory of, for students. And I think that if you had that foundation in how the brain works and how students absorb new information, and then you were handed a set of high quality instructional materials from which to build your lessons, you would have a much deeper understanding of sort of what the architects of the curriculum, why they arranged things the way they did, and it would help you access those materials in a deeper and more meaningful way with your kids. I think one of the biggest knocks we hear about instructional materials is we're turning teachers into automatons with scripted curricula, and all that tells me is that the folks who are levying those complaints haven't looked at a modern curricula at all. Because if you looked at any of the curricula that states are endorsing as high quality, I think you would find really thoughtful curation of content, really thoughtful building of skill within students. But that all requires a super skilled practitioner to unlock those materials, know how to adapt them, know how to present them, know how to engage students with them. And I do think a science of learning foundation would certainly make that easier for a young teacher.
Yeah, and it brings up the question about HQIRs or HQIMs and the push for those, which I think are, we talk about teachers needing good curricula and all of those things, but as I'm sure you know, that some of those HQIRs, HQIMs are not particularly as high quality as we want them to be. The curriculum may not be particularly coherent. They might be offering inquiry opportunities that are not particularly great, but seem like they're wonderful. So giving, I guess I'm curious if, and I think the science of learning probably gives some insight into that, but also has some limitations of our teachers, because one of the things here in Kentucky that there's initiatives for deeper learning. They're now calling vibrant learning is a different piece. It's a little more geared towards assessment, and project-based learning and inquiry are big pieces of that. But it's become clear that a lot of those materials that are supposed to be high quality are not particularly high quality in terms, especially in those areas. So there's a bit of a need for teachers, schools, perhaps somebody like me and our organization to help with that, to sort of figure out how do we use these supposedly high quality instructional resources to get to deeper learning, not just surface learning, but deeper learning and transfer learning, or DOK levels, whatever you want to call it. Is that something that can reasonably be built in teacher prep, or is that something you think comes later in the experience of teachers as they develop?
I think the earlier we expose teacher candidates, aspiring teachers to strong, high-quality instructional materials, the better. I mean, these are the materials and resources that in almost every state now they're going to be asked to or expected to be able to use. And one of the disconnects we see in teacher prep is there's still largely a build from scratch ethos in many programs, where the candidates are being asked to plan lessons without any underlying strong material. And I just think that's such a waste of time, right? If you can start by providing them, here's a high quality instructional resource. Here's the learning progression that the resource has been built on. Here's where the kids were, here's where they're going. You can understand that progression, and you can wrap your arms around it as a teacher candidate, and then you're asked to plan from that. I think that really sets the teacher up for doing that intellectual prep work that you just described. How do I take this good raw material and make it something that's going to provoke deeper learning, or build a project-based unit around it? I think there's room for all of those things, but if you're asking teachers to start from a blank page, or go source content from Teachers Pay Teachers and other low quality sources, or even worse, plug it into ChatGPT, which is the ultimate temptation right now. I think you're doing teacher candidates a disservice if you aren't building curriculum literacy within teacher prep, in your reading courses, in your math courses, in your science courses. I think there's enough good stuff out there now. I wouldn't have said this 20 years ago, but I think there's enough good stuff out there now that all teacher prep programs should be working with their district partners to understand, what are you using? How can we sync up so that when we do our clinical work, there's more of a seamless coherence between for the teacher candidates experience.
I'm curious if you, in your experience as in your teacher prep programming, and those of us who are a bit longer in the tooth, it strikes me that I don't remember explicit instruction and Rosenshine and cognitive load theory, things like that. But I do remember learning about working memory, which is cognitive load theory. So would you say that you learned about and experienced what has become known as some of those science of learning principles in your teacher prep, or was that something that was missing and maybe just wasn't as developed? You're, I think, probably younger than me, but not in your 20s like some of the teachers that I work with. So I'm curious how that looked in your teacher prep and maybe generationally.
Yeah, I learned nothing about any of that in teacher prep. I was a psychology undergraduate major, and so I had taken.
And you didn't learn about working memory?
I did as an undergraduate.
Okay.
I did. Yeah. So when I came to my teacher prep program, I had that background already in adolescent literacy, and I'd taken classes in child psychology and child development. So I had some of those concepts. I mean, they were foggy. I was an undergraduate, but they were there. And definitely use that to inform my teaching practice and the evolution of it, and have learned a lot more about it since. But definitely was not a point of emphasis within teacher prep at all.
Yeah, well, I mean, because I hear people say teachers are not learning about cognitive load theory, and I mean, I've talked with John Sweller, and I think it's wonderful work. I think it's important, but two things: are they learning about it, but it's not being called cognitive load theory or things like that, and I think the latter is more likely, is that they just did not particularly internalize it because they weren't applying it. They might have heard it, they might have been exposed to it, but didn't really remember it, can't retrieve it, if we want to talk about the cognitive science of it. And so because they didn't get an opportunity to put it into practice, whether that's with students or with lesson design or both, that it really just didn't stick. So what's the point of embedding it in teacher prep programs if that's the case?
Yeah, you're hitting right on the intense need for early clinical experiences embedded within every teacher prep program. We learned we did a case study on the program at Winston-Salem State in North Carolina. One of the things that they told us, which I just thought was so interesting, is they formed this partnership with a nonprofit that was plugged into the local school district, running tutoring centers all across the district in Winston-Salem. And they thought, well, wouldn't it be a great experience for our teacher candidates in their early content and methods coursework to go out and serve as tutors one or 2 days a week, way before they're ready for full-time student teaching. And the feedback loop it created seemed so powerful to them, because their students would learn something in coursework, go right out, have a chance to try it in their tutoring sessions, and then come back and tell the professors, well, you didn't prepare me for this. Like, this is the real experience that I just had, and I was flat-footed and didn't know how to respond. And it forced the professors to reflect on what they were doing, make some changes to their coursework, and then it forced the teacher candidate to reckon with what they didn't know and weren't prepared to do. And so, cause some reflection on the candidate as well. Mm. So I think those early experiences can do wonders for the individual candidate. But in this case, it was the program leaders who said, wow, we learned a ton about how we were failing to set our candidates up to meet the needs of the modern student. And they've made those course corrections and adjustments and continued this partnership. And now this is like, just a main way that they're preparing candidates is by doing this like cycle of instruction, go practice, reflect. Instruction, go practice, reflect.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, it's true of our professional learning that again, as I mentioned earlier, those reflective conversations after applying, if you want to think about it in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, that middle part of the, what everybody is familiar with of that pyramid, that's where you really make meaning of things and refine your craft, and through that practice. Switch gears a little bit here. You mentioned, states and policy. I've talked with, politicians and state level and about some of this as well. And it strikes me that most of them are fairly, I don't mean this pejoratively, because they've got lots of things on their plate and they're not meant to be education experts, but they're fairly ignorant of education and the mechanics of teaching and learning. And I'm curious if you can give any insight into those conversations, and because it sounds like your NCTQ is sort of giving some expertise to those states and people that are making, and maybe, some of the lobbying organizations and things like that.
Yeah, we do a ton of work around state policy related to teacher quality. Both pre-service and in service. And so we have a series of reports called the State of the States reports, where we do 50 state scans. We also include DC. So we have 51 entities in our mix, and we provide feedback to the states on a variety of different policy levers that they are pulling or not, across all the different policy topics that we care about. When it comes to prep, there are some basic things that we want to see states take on that many still don't, whether it's just setting really detailed content standards for what prep should be preparing teachers to know and be able to do with students. There are so many states where content standards are really thin or don't exist. And then what does the accountability look like for programs? So, set clear standards and create a robust review process for teacher prep programs that assesses whether or not they're meeting those standards. That's a missing piece in lots of states. Either they're ceding their authority to national accreditors who are in the business of, accrediting people. That's how they make their money. And so, there's kind of a weird incentive structure there. We think the state should own that process and run it itself. And then ultimately, most states have licensure test requirements that are designed to assess whether or not candidates are ready for the classroom, and many states use really low quality tests that are misaligned to their own content standards. So they're not really leveraging that as a signal. So those are just a few things that we look at on the state policy side in teacher prep. that we want to see, states take more seriously in some cases.
Are there any? This question came up? Vladimir Kogan asked it, and he's a professor at Ohio State University and has a really interesting book. He's been on the podcast about politics and how that's affected our schools and not generally the best ways. And he was asking, and I've asked this and explored a little bit with the reading wars, but I said I don't know for sure. It doesn't seem to me that one party, left or right, Democrat or Republican, that there's a sort of partisan valence to any of the pedagogy wars or even the reading wars. I mean, there's a sort of pressure from the right, I think, for something that's much more traditional. Although classical education should include lots of inquiry, and that's one of the things that sort of gets bandied about there. But have you seen any sort of partisan leanings in terms of, teaching methods and approaches that are worth commenting on?
We have not. So, in each of our reports, I think we have some standout states that are traditionally red and traditionally blue. So we haven't observed that phenomenon like in the metrics that we look at. I think you're right. I think education is, certainly partisan in some places, and but as far as our analyses go, I think we have strong examples, both blue and red, of states that are assuming their authority and building smart structures to ensure that teacher prep is moving in the right direction.
Yeah. In a related question, or I guess one of the things that I'm really passionate about, and I think is super, super important, sort of a side project of mine, is is civics and improving civics, especially in a way that reinforces what I call Enlightenment liberalism, which is essentially the underpinning of our democracy. And it's not liberalism as in left or democratic, but liberalism as in liberal science and things like that. So I think that that's a really missing piece in K-12 and would help us better navigate the sort of culture wars and polarization. And I think it's been done really poorly over the last several decades, and partly contributing to what we're experiencing now. I view that largely as an inquiry project. And so, when I think about teaching and teaching preparation and professional learning, I want teachers to embed and use cognitive science principles for sure, but also understand the power and why and how inquiry is so important for preparing what we call preparing students for the modern world. You used the term modern student before. And so, the ways in which those synergistically should come together doesn't strike me as being something that a lot of teachers have mastery over. I don't know if that's something you can build in teacher prep, but it's something that I think develops over time and certainly should be addressed in teacher prep. Maybe it sounds like I'm applying for the job right now, but how do those ideas and that thinking sort of fit with how NCTQ's vision of teacher prep and this transforming teacher prep initiative looks?
I couldn't agree with you more about the importance of civics education and how terrible a job we've done in recent years. I was part of the team in Massachusetts at the State Department of Ed that revamped our history and social science curriculum framework back in 2018. I would love to have you take a look at that document and see if you think it fits the bill. But we built that curriculum framework K through 12 focused on inquiry, focused on moving away from a march through time of dates, locations, and names, and really to get at the core questions that undergird our democracy and have kids really engage deeply with their role in preserving it and building upon it. So it's one of the things I'm most proud of in my career is that document, that we got it through the political process, we got it in place, and we have this beautiful curriculum framework in Massachusetts that. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think the state's role in sort of setting content standards, in this case, those standards for history and social studies, has a direct impact on what teacher prep programs are responding to, because their job is to prepare teachers to teach those state content standards. And so we have seen this like sort of backward in Massachusetts, it's like backward entry into prep by defining really specifically and really well, in my opinion, what kids should be learning around history and civics and social studies, K-12. It's had this necessary effect of changing what districts are doing, right? Districts had to throw out their old curricula or align to the old standards and start from new. In the case of Massachusetts, there was nothing on the market that mapped itself to our standards. So the state has actually started to build a K-12 curriculum. They started with the middle grades and they're expanding it up and down, which was the smart thing to do. And so now we're going to have this like tailored curriculum that is high quality, that is inquiry based, that is, unlocking all that dynamic type of instruction that we've been talking about. And then you've had to have teacher prep programs say, okay, if this is the stuff that our teachers are going to have to teach, how do we have to change what we're doing to respond to that? And so I think, again, it comes back to me time and time again, the power that state education agencies actually have in driving quality instruction in K-12 and the necessary preparation in that pre-service space.
Well, that's probably a good spot to end. Are there any things that we didn't talk about that you want to get out there, especially about the initiative? But I know you've also got, I was looking at the website, you've got a new tool, the District Policy Pathfinder, if you anything you want to say about that as well.
Sure, yeah. Around the Transforming Teacher Prep project, I'll say we're super excited about this experiment for us of what it looks like to directly support states and what it looks like to work directly with IHE leaders to provoke innovation, to make a better experience for teacher candidates. So that's exciting for us. You mentioned the District Pathfinder, District Policy Pathfinder. This is a tool that is something that is really exciting for NCTQ. We are building this chatbot interface that allows folks to query what we have as, to our knowledge, the largest collection of district policies in the country. Over 150 school districts are part of that, at least one district in every state. And users from district superintendents to union leaders to parents to researchers can access our data and learn about the length of the school day across the country. They can learn about average salaries. They can learn about benefits. They can learn about evaluation procedures. Any topic of interest related to teacher quality is in there, and we can't wait to see the fun things people are going to do with that tool and get some answers to questions that have long confounded the field.
Okay, so the website, if folks are not familiar, is nctq.org. You can find the Pathfinder on that page, and I'm sure we'll put a link to the posting about if anybody wants to apply for the job, other than me, because I've obviously just done that here in this podcast. Any other places that we should mention as far as links and things like that?
You can always follow us on the socials. It's easy to find us just by typing in NCTQ.
Okay. Well, thanks for the conversation, Ron. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Drew.